the yogurt shop murders, and the weight of false confessions. On February 20th, 2026, a judge in Austin, Texas said 3 words to a courtroom full of people who'd been waiting over 3 decades to hear them. "You are innocent." She was speaking to Michael Scott and Forrest Wellborn, 2 men who, along with Robert Springsteen and Maurice Pierce, had been accused in 1999 of one of the most notorious crimes in Austin's history. Michael Scott had spent years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Robert Springsteen had been sentenced to death before his conviction was overturned. Maurice Pierce spent 3 years in jail before charges were dismissed, and died in 2010 in a confrontation with police, never fully clearing his name. Forrest Wellborn lived for 25 years under the shadow of being called a monster. All 4 were teenagers when they were first questioned in 1991. All 4 were in their 20s when they were arrested in 1999. And all 4 were innocent. This is not an episode about the brutality of what happened on December 6, 1991. It's about what happened 8 years later. When detectives, under intense pressure to solve an infamous case, obtained confessions from 2 young men who had nothing to do with the crime. It's about how those confessions were produced, and it's about the lives that were destroyed in the process. The night of December 6, 1991. Shortly before midnight on December 6, 1991, an Austin Police Patrol officer noticed flames coming from an "I can't believe it's" yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane. Firefighters responded. They extinguished the blaze, and inside, they discovered something that would haunt Austin for decades. 4 teenage girls: Amy Ayers, 13 years old; Jennifer Harbison, 17 years old; her sister Sarah Harbison, 15 years old; and Eliza Thomas, 17 years old. All 4 had been bound, gagged, and shot in the head. At least one had been sexually assaulted. The shop had been doused with accelerant and set on fire. Jennifer and Eliza worked at the yogurt shop. Sarah and Amy had been there visiting them as they closed up for the night. The crime shocked Austin in ways that are difficult to overstate. This was 1991. Austin was smaller then, more intimate. This felt personal to everyone. Parents were terrified. The media coverage was relentless. And the pressure on police to solve this case was immediate and overwhelming. Austin police pursued thousands of leads. They received over 50 confessions from various people over the years, including one from serial killer Kenneth McDuff on the day of his execution in 1998. All of those confessions were false. In 1992, 2 Mexican nationals confessed while in custody in Mexico. Those confessions were later disputed and ruled false. A 16-year-old named Maurice Pierce was arrested within a week of the murders for bringing a gun to a local mall. The gun happened to be the same make and model as one used in the killings. Detective Hector Polanco interrogated Pierce for hours. Eventually, Pierce confessed. The next morning, Detective John Jones interviewed Pierce again. He realized immediately that Pierce's confession didn't match the crime scene. Ballistics analysis on Pierce's gun was inconclusive. Pierce was released, but his name stayed in the file. Years passed. The case remained unsolved. Evidence was limited. Fire and water damage from the sprinklers had destroyed much of what might have been collected. The community's grief didn't fade. It festered. Every anniversary, the case was back in the news. Every year, families asked, when will there be justice? And every year, detectives felt the weight of that unanswered question. This is the context that matters. Because in 1999, a new task force took over the case. They reviewed the old files. They identified 4 young men, now in their early 20s, who had been teenagers in 91. Maurice Pierce, whose confession had been dismissed in 1991. Robert Springsteen, 24 years old. Michael Scott, 25 years old. Forrest Wellborn, 26 years old. The task force believed they had credible suspects, but they had no physical evidence. What they needed were confessions. In September of 1999, all 4 men were brought in for questioning. They were no longer teenagers, but psychologically, they were still vulnerable to the techniques that would be used against them. None had significant criminal histories. None had experience navigating high-stakes interrogations. and all of them were about to face detectives who genuinely believed, that they were guilty. What happened next would become the only evidence used to convict Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott. Because no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no eyewitness testimony ever connected any of these four men to the crime. The entire case rested on confessions. Robert Springsteen, the first to break. Robert Springsteen was 24 years old when detectives interrogated him in September of '99. The interrogation followed the Reed technique. It began with direct confrontation. "We know you were involved." It continued with certainty statements. "The evidence is clear." It employed minimization. "This wasn't your idea. You just got caught up in something." And it used the alternative question. "Did you plan this? Or did things just get out of hand?" The interrogation lasted hours. Springsteen denied involvement repeatedly, but the detectives didn't accept his denials. They interrupted them. They dismissed them. They told him his denials didn't matter because the evidence already proved his guilt. This is step 3 of the Reed technique, handling denials. The goal is to prevent the suspect from psychologically committing to their denial. Because the more someone says, "I didn't do this," the harder it becomes for them to later say, "I did." So denials are cut off, minimized, reframed as resistance rather than truth. The psychological breaking point. After hours of this, after being told repeatedly that denial was futile, that the evidence was overwhelming, that his only choice was to explain his involvement, Robert Springsteen confessed. He said he had participated in the murders. He implicated Michael Scott. He provided details. Later, Springsteen would say the confession was coerced, that detectives had fed him information, that he told them what they wanted to hear because he believed it was the only way to end the interrogation. This is the psychology of compliant false confessions. The suspect knows they're innocent, but they confess anyway because the immediate pain of the interrogation becomes unbearable. They believe cooperation will lead to leniency. They trust that the truth will eventually come out and protect them. All of those assumptions are wrong. But in the moment, under psychological pressure, they feel rational. Michael Scott, the second confession. Michael Scott was 25 years old. He had been married for 1 year. He had a 3-year-old daughter. When detectives interrogated him, they already had Robert Springsteen's confession implicating him. This changed the dynamic entirely. Now detectives can say, "Your friend already told us you were there. We know you were involved." This is your chance to tell your side. This is step 2 of the Reed technique. Theme development. The interrogator offers a face-saving narrative. "We know you didn't plan this. We know you got caught up in something." This is your chance to explain what really happened. Psychologically, this does 2 things. First, it normalizes the crime, makes it seem understandable rather than monstrous. Second, it implies that confession will lead to better treatment. Neither is a promise, but the brain fills in that gap. The confession. Michael Scott confessed. He said he participated in the murders. He implicated Robert Springsteen. His confession corroborated Springsteen's in key ways, which made both confessions seem more credible. But here's the problem with confession corroboration. When 2 suspects are interrogated separately and their confessions match, it can mean they're both telling the truth, or it can mean they were both fed the same information. In this case, detectives had access to the case file. They knew the crime scene. They knew the details. And those details appeared in both confessions. This is called confession contamination. When interrogators, intentionally or unintentionally, supply information that only the perpetrator should know, that information gets incorporated into the confession. Later, when the confession is presented in court, those details make it seem credible. But the source of those details wasn't the suspect's memory. It was the interrogator's knowledge. Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn, no confessions. Maurice Pierce and Forrest Wellborn were also interrogated. Neither confessed. Pierce, who had falsely confessed in 1991, only to have his confession dismissed, refused to confess again. Wellborn maintained his innocence throughout. The theory developed by the task force was this. All 4 were involved. Springsteen and Scott were inside the shop. Pierce and Wellborn waited outside as lookouts. But without confessions from Pierce and Wellborn, the prosecution's case against them was weak. Pierce's charges were eventually dropped. Wellborn was charged but never indicted. 2 grand juries refused to indict him because there wasn't enough evidence. Only Springsteen and Scott went to trial. And the only evidence against them was their own confession. Robert Springsteen was tried in 2001. Michael Scott was tried in 2002. Both trials followed the same pattern. The prosecution presented detailed, graphic descriptions of the crime. They presented the confessions. They argued that the confessions contained details only the killers could know. But there was no physical evidence, no DNA linking them to the scene, no fingerprints, no eyewitness testimony, no forensic evidence of any kind, just the confession. The defense argument. Both Springsteen and Scott recanted their confessions before trial. They testified that the confessions were coerced. They described the interrogation tactics used, the hours of questioning, the refusal to accept denials, the psychological pressure, the theme development that made confessions seem like the only option. Their attorneys argued that the confessions were false, that they were the product of the Reed technique interrogation applied to young men under intense pressure. But juries find it almost impossible to believe that someone would confess to a crime they didn't commit. It's psychologically counterintuitive. Why would an innocent person say they murdered 4 girls? The answer? That confession can be a rational response to unbearable psychological pressure. Doesn't match our intuitions about how innocent people behave. Both were convicted. Robert Springsteen was sentenced to death. Michael Scott was sentenced to life in prison. In his cell, Robert Springsteen faced execution for a crime he didn't commit. Michael Scott watched his daughter grow up through prison glass. Maurice Pierce, though never convicted, lived under the stigma of being accused of one of Austin's most infamous crimes. Forrest Wellborn struggled to find work, lost friends, and at one point was homeless, all because his name had been associated with the case. At his exoneration hearing in 2026, Michael Scott testified about what those years cost him. I lost my family. I lost my youth. My daughter was 3 years old when I was arrested. We had just celebrated our first wedding anniversary. I lost the chance to build a family. Every day I have carried the weight of a crime I did not commit. Robert Springsteen's attorney, Amber Farrelly, reminded the court, "Let us not forget that Robert Springsteen could be dead right now, executed at the hands of the state of Texas." Forrest Wellborn, in a statement read by his attorney, described losing everything. "I lost friends. I struggled to keep jobs. I was at one time homeless." Maurice Pierce never got to stand in that courtroom. He died in 2010 in a confrontation with police after a traffic stop. His daughter, Marissa Pierce, spoke at the exoneration hearing. "Daddy, you have your name back. The world knows what you were trying to say all along." In 2006, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned Robert Springsteen's conviction. The issue wasn't that the confession was false. The issue was that prosecutors had violated the Confrontation Clause of the U.S. Constitution by using Michael Scott's confession against Springsteen when Scott couldn't be cross-examined. In 2007, Michael Scott's conviction was overturned on similar grounds. Both men were released on bond in June 2009. Robert Springsteen walked out of death row. Michael Scott walked out after 7 years in prison. But they weren't exonerated. They were released pending retrial. The prosecution fully intended to try them again. But there was a problem. DNA testing technology had advanced since 1991. New tests were run on biological evidence collected from one of the victims. The results showed a single male DNA profile. It didn't match Robert Springsteen. It didn't match Michael Scott. It didn't match Maurice Pierce or Forrest Wellborn. The prosecution was now in an impossible position. Their entire case rested on confessions, but the confessions said all 4 men were involved. The DNA said there was one unknown male. Both couldn't be true. On October 28, 2009, all charges against Springsteen and Scott were dismissed. The prosecutor at the time, Rosemary Limburg, released a statement saying, "I remain confident that both Springsteen and Scott are responsible for the deaths at the yogurt shop, but it would not be prudent to risk a trial until we also know the nature of the involvement of this unknown male." Read that carefully. Even in dismissing the charges, the prosecutor maintained belief in their guilt. This is confirmation bias at work. Once investigators and prosecutors commit to a theory, once confessions exist, it becomes psychologically difficult to accept that the entire theory was wrong. The confessions create a narrative. That narrative feels true. Evidence that contradicts it gets explained away rather than accepted. 7 jurors from the original trials later stated they would not have convicted Springsteen and Scott if they had known about the DNA evidence. But by then, both men had already lost years of their lives. For 16 years after the charges were dismissed, there were no new developments. Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, and Forrest Wellborn tried to rebuild their lives. Maurice Pierce was dead. The victims' families still had no answers. And then, in September of 2025, Austin police made an announcement. Using advanced DNA analysis and reviewing old ballistics evidence, investigators had identified a suspect. Robert Eugene Brashers. Brashers was a serial killer who died in 1999 during a standoff with police in Missouri. Since 2018, authorities had used DNA evidence to link him to the strangulation death of a woman in South Carolina in 1990, the rape of a 14-year-old girl in Tennessee in 97, the shooting of a mother and daughter in Missouri in 98. Investigators found that Brashers had been arrested at a border checkpoint near El Paso 2 days after the yogurt shop murders. In his stolen car was a pistol that matched the caliber used to kill one of the girls. The DNA found at the yogurt shop matched Brashers. His other crimes showed the same pattern. Victims tied up with their own clothing, sexually assaulted, crime scenes set on fire. Travis County First Assistant District Attorney Trudy Strasburger said it plainly. Simply said, both the science and the confessions can't be true. The truth is that Robert Eugene Brashers is guilty, and he alone committed the yogurt shop murders. On February 20th, 2026, Judge Dana Blasey declared all 4 men officially innocent. Not just charges dismissed, not just insufficient evidence, innocent. Trudy Strasburger, representing the state that had prosecuted them, stood before the court and said, over 25 years ago, the state prosecuted 4 innocent men for one of the worst crimes Austin has ever seen. We could not have been more wrong. She acknowledged that the wrongful prosecutions had left the defendant screaming into the wind for decades. She said it was now our turn to accept responsibility. The yogurt shop case is a textbook example of how false confessions are produced. Not through physical coercion, not through obvious brutality, but through psychological tactics applied over hours to people who are vulnerable, exhausted, and trusting. Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott were not teenagers when they confessed. They were in their mid-20s, but they had no experience with interrogation, no understanding of how the Reid technique works, no knowledge that police are allowed to lie, to claim evidence exists when it doesn't, to minimize the crime and imply leniency. They trusted that if they cooperated, the truth would protect them. They were wrong. Both confessions contained details that seemed to prove guilt, but those details came from the interrogators, not from the suspect's memories. This is why recording full interrogations, not just the confession itself, is critical. When only the confession is recorded, contamination is invisible. When the full interrogation is recorded, you can see where information flows from interrogator to suspect. In this case, there were no recordings of what was said to Springsteen and Scott before they confessed. We don't know what details were mentioned, what theories were suggested, what information was fed. That absence made it impossible to determine whether the confessions were authentic memories or constructed narratives. This case didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a community traumatized by the murders of 4 children. It happened under media scrutiny and public demand for resolution. It happened with political pressure on police to solve one of Austin's most infamous crimes. Under that pressure, tolerance for ambiguity disappears. The need for closure becomes overwhelming. And when suspects confess, when they provide that closure, the relief is so powerful that contradictory evidence gets rationalized away. Even when DNA doesn't match, even when the confessions contain inconsistencies, even when both men recanted immediately, the confessions felt true. And in the absence of other answers, the system committed to them. Robert Springsteen spent years on death row. If his conviction hadn't been overturned on a technicality, if the DNA testing hadn't advanced, he he could have been executed. Michael Scott lost his family, his youth, his daughter's childhood. Maurice Pierce died before his name was cleared. Forrest Wellborn lived 25 years as a pariah. And while they suffered, the real killer, Robert Eugene Brashers, remained free for 8 more years. He went on to rape a 14-year-old girl. He went on to murder a mother and daughter. The false confessions didn't just destroy 4 innocent lives. They allowed a serial killer to continue hunting. The yogurt shop case reveals something uncomfortable about how the system works. Confessions are given enormous weight, even when they're the only evidence. Interrogation tactics designed to produce confessions are legally permissible, even when they're psychologically coercive. And once confessions exist, they create momentum that's extraordinarily difficult to reverse. This isn't about individual malice. The detectives who interrogated Springsteen and Scott genuinely believed they were guilty. The prosecutors who tried them believed the confessions were real. The jurors who convicted them couldn't imagine innocent people confessing to murder. Everyone was doing what they thought was right. But the system itself, the interrogation methods, the legal standards, the psychological assumptions, produced catastrophic outcomes. At his exoneration hearing, Michael Scott said, "No court ruling can return the years and the love that were taken from me. But it can acknowledge the truth. I am not guilty." The truth is rarely as simple as we want it to be. The yogurt shop murders are solved now. Robert Eugene Brashers killed those 4 girls. But the case will never be clean, because 4 innocent men lost decades of their lives to false confessions that should never have been obtained, should never have been trusted, and should never have been the sole evidence in capital murder trials. The question this case asks is not just did they confess, it's how was that confession produced? What tactics were used? What pressure was applied? What details were fed? And what was the psychological state of the person saying those words? Because confession is not always truth. Sometimes it's survival. Sometimes it's compliance. Sometimes it's the only way out of a room. The next time you hear about a case where someone confessed, ask yourself, how long was the interrogation? What tactics were used? Was it recorded in full? Was the person vulnerable, young, intellectually disabled, mentally ill, exhausted? Did they recant? Does physical evidence support the confession? Don't assume confession equals guilt. Assume confession requires scrutiny. Because if we've learned anything from the yogurt shop case, it's this. The system can be catastrophically wrong, and when it is, lives are destroyed. If you're interested in understanding how interrogations work, how false confessions happen, and how to think critically about our criminal cases, consider subscribing. This channel examines not just what happened, but how the process itself shapes outcomes. Case by case.